Okay, good morning. Thank you for joining us for the 20th Annual Town History Series at the Patent Free Library. My name is Mary Kate Kwasnick, and I'm the Archivist and Special Collections Librarian in the Sagadahoc History and Genealogy Room at the Patent Free Library, and I'm so pleased that you could join us today. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have a few important bits of information to share. No. It's on, but it's not working. This year's series in its 20th iteration. It is?
People closer.
Is this what? No. This year's series in its 20th iteration, I'll hold it just in case it starts working, is dedicated to Peter Goodwin. Peter was a longtime history room manager, Bath Historical Trustee, and the founder of the Town History series. This series began in 2005, and since then, Peter worked tirelessly to build momentum year after year to bring us to where we are today. Our community looks forward to these talks every year, and it's because of Peter's dedication and that of his successors that we are all here together today. I also want to thank all of the historical societies and member towns for selecting our wonderful speakers and helping to get the word out. Thank you also to the Bath Historical Society for generously offering to professionally film the series. If you're with us in person today, please note that the speaker is being filmed by a camera in the back of the room in our kitchen, so please be careful when you're passing by. This recording will be available in our collection on DVD, and it will be available for, thank you, and will be available for checkout. The Zoom recording of today's program will be available on our YouTube page next week. If you're joining us on Zoom, please note that this is a Zoom webinar, so you can't unmute or turn on your camera, but you can use the chat and Q&A feature. If you would like to enable closed captioning, please click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen to turn them on. And please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A feature, and I will help get those questions to our speaker at the end of the talk. Also, please note that you won't be able to hear the questions asked during the Q&A since the audience doesn't have microphones, but keep an eye on the chat where I will type in the questions being asked and Denise will repeat them into the microphone. Our speaker today represents Arrowsic. Denise Parker was born and raised in Mount Vernon, Ohio, but spent summers at her family's camp on Weber Road in Georgetown. Denise and her husband Craig raised 4 boys while she worked in nursing and eventually as a chief operating officer at a hospital system in Ohio before retiring 6 years ago. Since then, Denise has become the town administrator for Arrowsic and currently serves on the board of Grandmothers for Reproductive Rights. Denise has also been a docent for Maine's First Ship and was part of the crew that sailed the Virginia to Booth Bay Harbor for Windjammer days. Although Denise and Craig are officially Ohio residents, Maine is where their heart is. Welcome, Denise.
Thank you. So there are a lot of people here from Arrowsic. Why don't you raise your hand if you're from Arrowsic? Oh, wow. So I have to, thank you. So I have to be honest, I guess, with this. I have a joke for y'all. This morning on Facebook, I was just kind of scrolling to calm my nerves. It makes me more nervous. One of my high school classmates posted something that I thought was really hilarious. She said, the best thing about the Super Bowl is the commercials and the food. Who cares how many baskets they make? It's a good one. So this may seem like kind of a grim topic, but none of us gets out of this alive. And as a nurse, that really came home to me in all my years as a nurse. I've been interested in cemeteries for a long time because of genealogy and people's stories. I really didn't like history in high school because it was just so dry, and I'm not good at memorizing dates. But when I could relate to people's personal lives, it was much more meaningful and interesting. So just imagine, I'm going to be talking mostly about these cemeteries that were created back in the 1700s and 1800s. And imagine what life was like on Arrowsic in those days. You know, no electricity. You had to carry your water unless you were lucky enough to be able to dig a well. And you really couldn't get off the island easily. The bridges and the ferries didn't happen until later. So people were really a community on the island. And the residents, their occupations were fishing, farming, cutting lumber, trapping, and building ships. Believe it or not, they built ships on Arrowsic, on the Sassanoa side mostly. So life wasn't easy and the families were close. And so marriages, births, and deaths were community occasions really on Arrowsic. And just as an aside, something I heard recently, and I actually looked it up to see if it was true. In New England, 30 to 40% of brides were already pregnant by the time they got married. I thought that was, yeah, that's a lot. So when I really like this quote. I think not only do we need to learn how to die because we don't get out of this alive, it's how we do it that counts. I think that we also need to learn how to live. So when I was talking, my 4 boys, who I drive nuts anyway, I was talking with one of them about this talk and what to call it. And I think he's on Zoom, at least he registered. So I hope I don't say anything that embarrasses him. He's an attorney in Columbus. So we were talking about this talk and this was the title he suggested. And I thought maybe Good Bones was a pop culture reference because I think there used to be a TV show called Good Bones. And he said, not really. He was thinking about the old family homes and the families on the island and the cemeteries, and thought Good Bones was an appropriate title. I didn't want to offend anyone, so I asked Mary Kate, and she's probably a millennial just like him, and she loved it. So that's how it got this title. So I have a disclaimer. I'm from away. I live in Ohio, but like Mary Kate said, I've spent 58 years coming up here to Arrowsic and Georgetown. And we still have a family camp back Weber Road all the way toward the end. And it was kind of like living in Arrowsic back in the 17 or 1800s. We had no electricity, no running water. And we had to hike through the woods to get there. And I loved it. But my husband, Craig, who's in the yellow Fallies here, we have a home on Preble Point Road in Arrowsic. We had a sailboat and we used to sail all over the world. And then Craig had a stroke 20 years ago next month. And sorry if that's too much information, but then we started looking for land up here and built a house here. So I'm just getting started on this research on the cemeteries. I'm not an expert at it. So if you know something, say something. One of the things I changed in a lot of the history is that I don't like using the term Indians. My mother's side is Native American. I don't look it, I know. But so, and then we live in Ohio, and the Cleveland Indians changed their name a couple of years ago because of all the grief they got. So they're now the Columbus Guardians. I mean, the Cleveland Guardians. We live near Columbus. So anywhere that the history said Indian, I changed it to Indigenous peoples. So that's why. So it kind of helps to know the history of Arrowsic in order to know where to look for records. And I found that there's a lot of conflict in a lot of the records from this time. So back in the day, Georgetown consisted of Bath, West Bath, Phippsburg, and Arrowsic, and Georgetown. And then the towns started splitting off from the big Georgetown. And in 1841, Arrowsic separated. And then after that, Saginaw County was established. And I believe it was established from Lincoln County, but I should have researched that. So a lot of the cemetery records may not be in the town where you think they should be. And I found a lot of information that didn't agree. So the Preble Massacre is one example, and I'll talk more about that later. So Arrowsic used to be the center of shipbuilding in this area, and mostly over on the Sassanoa side. And the reason that the Sassanoa became the center of shipbuilding is that navigation on the Kennebec beyond Bluff Head, where it's part of the dogleg of the Kennebec, navigation until it was charted was really difficult. So big boats didn't go around Bluff Head, and it was easier for them to come on the Sassanoa. So, but once it was charted, then the shipbuilding center moved to Bath, which at that time was called Long Reach. And then ferries and bridges started connecting Arrowsic to Bath, and a lot of people could then go to work in Bath. So our population decreased after that. So the reason I got interested in this research is twofold. I've done a lot of genealogy research, and back when I was in upper elementary, junior high, that age, my grandfather used to talk with me about his mother who came over from England as a 17-year-old by herself and settled in Mount Vernon, Ohio, where I grew up. And by the way, Mount Vernon's claim to fame is Paul Lynde. If you remember Paul Lynde. He and my stepdad were in the same class. So Grandpa would talk about England and, where his mother was from, the West Country, Devonshire. And at the time, the Beatles were really popular. So I started doing genealogy research on the Mill side of my family, thinking that maybe I could find some connection to the Beatles. That didn't work out so well. But then last September, just before we went back to Ohio, I was giving blood in Topsom, and I get a call from somebody who I didn't recognize the name, so I let it go to voicemail. And she was visiting from either New York or Pennsylvania, I forget which, and was looking for the Preble family cemetery. And she had driven up Preble Point Road, and my husband was out walking our dog, and she stopped and talked with him, and he had no clue, and gave her my phone number. So that was what, and as town administrator, I knew that there were some records in town hall, but I had never looked at them. So I started doing some research and found some old information and called a property owner on the north part of Arrowsic, and the cemetery was on her property. And she met the woman and showed her where the cemetery was. So that kind of prompted my research. So what I found in the town hall files was some research that had been done in the early 70s by Millie Stafford, and I'm sure many of you knew who Millie Stafford was, and Harold Brown, who was the director of the Bath Marine Museum, which is now Maine Maritime Museum. And these were typewritten records. So there was an outline of Arrowsic with numbers on it corresponding to this list here of all the cemeteries. But the locations are not very exact. Even in the description, which is the picture on the right, it has the name of the cemetery and the people who are buried there with a little bit of information about them. And it was really interesting going through all of this. So that's how I got started. And then I started looking for some of these cemeteries. And I hope when the weather gets better and I'm back in May that I can start looking for more of these cemeteries and drop a pin. Does anybody know what drop a pin is? My friend Ellie over there taught me how to do that, but it's for the coordinates, longitude and latitude, so you can find things where they exactly are. And then put it into a website called Find a Grave, which is free, by the way. And if you're trying to find a grave, you can use that to put in the person's name, birth date, death date, and where they lived, and hopefully get the information that you need. It's really
got all the gravy right there.
Yeah, but you have to be careful with that information because some of it's not accurate, I found out. So I also found Dee Dee Jorgensen gave me the map that's on the left that is from 1858, and that shows where all of the family farms were in Arrowsic in 1858. Obviously, they didn't have color copies back then, but that was kind of interesting because I could narrow them down a little bit more. And then the one on the right, Harold Brown at the Bath Marine Museum added a little more detail to the map. So it has some of the roads and everything, so I can find things a little bit better, a little easier. And a lot of them are really hard to find, I'm told. But how many cemeteries are there in Arrowsic? Some sources say 23, some say 26, and there may be more of them. The original list only listed 23, but there are 2 that are missing from that list. The size of the cemeteries ranges from 1 marked grave to many marked and unmarked graves. There are a lot of field stones in some cemeteries that are not marked at all. And the cemetery, some of the cemetery names and the names on the map are listed here on the right, the family names. And you can still see a lot of these names around here. By the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning, I learned this morning after I got here that the word cemetery in Greek means place of sleep. Just a little factoid. So this isn't a mistake. This is a trick, and Jeffrey, if you're listening, I listened to you. Jeffrey's the son who suggested the title. He started out working as a lawyer at Jones Day, which is one of the largest law firms in the country, before he decided he wanted a life, and he and another guy left and formed their own law firm. But he said that one of the tricks he learned at Jones Day is when you're doing a PowerPoint, leave one slide blank so people focus on you rather than on the slides. So that's why. And I wanted to say there's a lot of discrepancy out there among the various sites. Like Find a Grave lists people who they say are buried in Arrowsic cemeteries that actually aren't. So you have to really be careful with any source that you're using to find information. How many of you are on Ancestry.com? Wow, quite a few of you. I use Ancestry a lot. I've put a lot of information in there. And you know how it suggests somebody else's family tree or something that somebody else has found about? You really have to be careful about adding that to your family tree. And just as an example, my cousin Scott started putting a family tree in, and he chose someone as our great-grandfather who isn't. The guy had the same name, born in the same town, around the same time, but he's not our great-grandfather. And I found a lot of that. So you really have to go back to the source. I think that the separation of the towns from Georgetown created a lot of that confusion about the early graves. So you may find things in the Georgetown Historical Society when the person actually lived in Arrowsic and is buried here. Harold Brown had an explanation that a woman who was working on Arrowsic's cemeteries and graves died before she finished, and apparently she was very meticulous about her records, but she hadn't finished the research, and the person who published it wasn't quite as meticulous, and so there are some errors in it. I'm not going to discuss every cemetery, but I'll give some highlights and some pictures from various cemeteries on the island. So the Preble Cemetery is one of the oldest cemeteries in Saginaw County. And like I mentioned earlier, it's on the north side of the island. Jonathan and Rebecca Preble are buried there. They were the parents of Ebenezer and Mary Harnden Preble, who were killed by, oh, I didn't change my slides. I'm sorry. I changed my notes. They were killed by indigenous peoples in Woolwich on June 9th, 1758, and that's referred to as the Preble Massacre. So the indigenous peoples who killed the parents, they were supposed to, or they had been planning to go to the Harndens' strong house, but waited an extra day to plant their corn. And that's why they got caught. They weren't in the strong house. So the indigenous peoples who killed them took their 6 kids and headed to Quebec. But the youngest was still breastfeeding, and they had no means of breastfeeding this young child and killed the baby. So they sold these 5 surviving kids to the French in Quebec, and eventually 4 of the children, 2 girls and 2 boys, were rescued and returned to Woolwich. And a 3rd daughter, who was adopted by a French family in Quebec, was so young, she had no memory of her original family or her home. And so she stayed with that family and ended up moving to France and being raised there. It would be really fun to find out about her descendants and what they know about this. Find a Grave lists the Preble family cemetery as the site of Ebenezer and Mary Preble's graves. However, the inventory of the cemeteries that was done back in the early 70s doesn't list them as being buried there. Allison Hepler and Amanda Martin did a talk 2 weeks ago, I think, about Days Ferry, and talked about the Preble Cemetery and that there's a monument there for the Preble Massacre. Thanks to them, I got that information. So I was at Georgetown Historical Society one day earlier this week, and they say the location of the massacre is actually not known, that it could have been Longreach, Woolwich, or Arrowsic. The Arrowsic comprehensive plan that was done years ago says that it happened in Arrowsic. So there's a lot of dispute there. So here are some pictures from the Preble family cemetery. It's on the corner of Moose Point Lane and Field Road, and it's very close to the road. But here are some of the gravestones that are in that cemetery. It mentions in the history that there are death's head motifs on a number of the gravestones in the cemetery. I don't remember if I got this one from one of the gravestones in the Preble family cemetery, but it is actually on a gravestone somewhere. So this symbol was often used in the 17th century and is on a lot of graves in Arrowsic. The symbol often has wings or crossed bones or both, and it has a stylized skull. The speculation is that the winged skulls were intended to symbolize a combination of physical death and spiritual regeneration. I think it's kind of cool. Here's Jonathan Preble's gravestone. It has the death's head symbol. It's been broken. I really like the line at the bottom. This is his epitaph. But I like the line at the bottom, he was a good man. This is his wife Rebecca's grave. A little interesting information about her. She was born in, her maiden name is Harvey. She was born in London in 1699, And in 1704, when she was 5 years old, she was sentenced to bondage in America. She may have been an orphan at that time. According to Wikipedia, indentured servitude in British America was the prominent system of labor in the colonies until it was eventually supplanted by slavery. So here's a Preble family work crew. For a number of years, descendants of the Preble family, and there's one living in, I believe it's Pittsburgh, and she did some research and got descendants together. And on Memorial Day weekend, for a number of years, they would come and work on cleaning up the cemetery and restoring gravestones. This, I think, was the last year they did it, May of 2017. But that would be cool.
I happen to know some of his family, and he's related to me primarily. And they are still doing it.
Are they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Could you all hear Lucy? She said that she knows some of the family and they are still doing the cleanup. So again, I was given some misinformation on that. So, and this is the Snipe Drummond burial ground, and it's on the Weiss property in Arrowsic, and they're here. And I thank David for giving me a lot of this information about that cemetery. So the picture on the left is the cemetery taken in the snow. You can see that it's quite large. And on the right is a really old picture from one of the ship launchings at Bath Iron Works, and it was taken from across the river. And you can see the gravestones lined up along the shore there. One of the interesting stones in that cemetery is for Parker Drummond, who was lost at sea. And there are a number of such inscriptions on gravestones across Arrowsic. And, you know, because they're lost, there's no one buried there, I would assume, but they erected a gravestone anyway. There are approximately 14 Drummond gravestones in this cemetery and many more Snipe gravestones. And this is an interesting one that should be in the cemetery, but it's not there. This is for Silas S. Snipe, and he died in 1888. And the stone is by the side of the road, the old McPherson-Georgetown Stagecoach Road, some distance away from the cemetery, and no one knows how it got there. Maybe it was stolen. I don't know. But it belongs in that Snipe Drummond or Drummond Snipe burying ground. Here's a picture from 1900 of the Snipe homestead, and this Drummond Snipe cemetery is on this property. And here's a picture of it today. And as of December of 2023, it's now on the National Register of Historic Places in Maine. Congratulations. The Whitmore Cemetery has a couple of interesting stones. And I'm sorry I don't have pictures of this one, but I didn't have time to go wade through the snow and the mud. James Colliard Whitmore died in 1851 at age 29 in California. The California Gold Rush happened between 1848 and 1855, and about 300,000 people from across the United States and other countries were drawn to California for the gold rush. And I wonder if James went there hoping to make his fortune and then died there. And his body probably wasn't shipped back to Arrowsic, I would guess. Yes, there's a stone there. And Charles Whitmore. Now, if you notice, these two were supposedly brothers, although I think there was an age, maybe quite an age difference, but they had different mothers. And I haven't done any research on that to see if they really are brothers. But Charles died in 1864 at age 27, a prisoner of war in Texas. He possibly died at the POW camp in Tyler. It was called Camp Ford in Tyler, Texas. It was the largest one west of the Mississippi. It's estimated that over 200,000 Union soldiers were captured during the Civil War. Of that 211,000, almost 195,000 of them were imprisoned, and about 15.4% of them died while they were imprisoned. The prevailing illness and cause of death at the time was scurvy in these prisoner of war camps, and that's due to a lack of vitamin C. And scurvy also killed a lot of sailors on long distance voyages because they didn't get the fresh fruits and vegetables where vitamin C can be found. There are 4 Stinson burying grounds or cemeteries in Arrowsic. I thought this one was interesting because it says that Frederick died in 1819 at St. Iago, Cuba. I couldn't find an actual town called St. Iago, Cuba. It turns out it's an old name or what people assumed Santiago, Cuba was. So he died there. Pardon? Right. I've been to Cuba twice, but I haven't been to Santiago. It's a way cool country if you ever get to go. It's not known if he was a seaman, but at the time there were issues with the slave trade. And he may have been there. He may have been on a ship that was involved in slave trading. The prevalent diseases at the time in Cuba were yellow fever and cholera. And then another interesting stone in that cemetery, which is the James Stinson burying ground, is for Rachel Stinson, who drowned in Spring Cove in 1778 at age 13. And thanks to Mike Kremler, who's here, for this information. So a vessel had returned from a voyage and was being fitted out for her next voyage on the Sassanoa side of Arrowsic, there at Spring Cove, and they were brought around to take lumber from the mills, and they anchored off the entrance to Spring Cove. A young woman named Mary, who was probably a servant in the Stinson family, had never seen a vessel before, and she was crazy to get on board. She really wanted to be on board to see what it looked like. So Mary and Elizabeth Stinson, also known as Aunt Betsy, who was 67, and Rachel Stinson, 13-year-old, sneaked out of the house one day with a young man who lived with the family, and they took what was referred to as a float out to the ship. It was probably a canoe. The 4 of them went out there. The man had to go to the outside of the vessel in order to get to the ladder. The big girl, as she's referred to, and I assume that that was Mary, was the first to catch the chains, and she stepped up on the side of the float, pushed with her feet, and turned the whole thing over. And everybody in it went into the river. Mary couldn't hold on, and she fell in as well. The young man couldn't see the others, but he finally saw a corner of Aunt Betsy's poplin dress. She hadn't bothered to change after church. And it was floating on the water. So he found her and took his paddle and was able to get her head and shoulders up above the water, and then raced to the house. So the alarm was spread. The family grabbed what restoratives they had on hand. I would love to know what the restoratives were. And they ran to the cove. They found Aunt Betsy the way the boy left her, without any signs of life, but they didn't see Mary or Rachel. And eventually enough help arrived that they could do a search, and their bodies were found. Every effort was made to restore life, without success, except for Aunt Betsy. And then she gasped and showed signs of life. A long and severe illness followed, though. And I don't know how long she lived after that. Rachel's and Mary's bodies were rolled in blankets, put on a sled, and taken back to the house. So this is Rachel's gravestone, and you can see the death's head. Oh, I'm sorry, it's got, can I get rid of that? There. Okay, you can see the really nice death's head motif up above there. Let's see. So there was another motif that was common back at that time, and that was the weeping willow motif. While its form suggests grief and sorrow, in many religions, it suggests immortality. It was one of the more popular motifs in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So in the Stinson family graveyard, and remember there are 4 Stinson cemeteries in Arrowsic. In this particular one, John and Louisa Stinson lost 3 children in the same month, actually within 2 days, lost 3 young children. Louisa and Sarah Abby died on the same day, and they're buried in the same grave in this cemetery. Interestingly, the grandparents of these kids, James and Abigail Stinson, both died on February 13th, 1841, so 7 years before these kids. They were in their 80s. I couldn't find any cause of death recorded, but they're buried in the same grave. Here's a drawing of the Stinson homestead from 1900. And here's an article. I didn't put that picture in the article is from 1947. So the land parcel was sold to James Stinson Jr. in 1742. And this house was built in 1847. So about 100 years later. And then in 1947, David Stinson sold the house, and it made the Bath Independent newspaper. It was in the Stinson family for more than 200 years. And down at the bottom, it says that it was the last old Stinson family farm in Arrowsic. And the Jorgensens have lived there since 1952. So Newtown Cemetery is the largest one in Arrowsic. There are quite a number of fallen and broken stones and a lot of unmarked field stones. It's on the north side of Bald Head Road. So there used to be a village in that area called Newtown, and it was founded in 1680 by Thomas Clark and 26 men with their families. And they built Newtown Fort, but it was doomed by the outbreak of King William's War, which was between 1689 and 1698. So the enterprise was abandoned, but in 1714, a new group resettled Newtown. And in 1718, it was officially incorporated as Georgetown on Arrowsic Island. There were about 40 dwellings when it was reestablished, 5 of which were garrisons. The residents owned lots of cattle, so they were cattle farmers. And in 1763, the first meeting house and church in Arrowsic were built at Newtown. Here are some pictures. I couldn't get the whole thing in, so I took a number of pictures of the Newtown Cemetery. And there are a lot of unmarked field stones in here as well. Some of the interesting gravestones here in the Newtown Cemetery, 3 young children of Samuel and Rachel Beals are buried here, as well as the parents. So this couple lost 3 of their young kids within 12 days. I couldn't find any cause of death, but the most common cause of death in the 1800s, causes of death, were consumption, which we now know as TB, typhoid fever, scarlet fever, croup diphtheria, influenza, and cholera. Could have been any of those. Someone keeps these graves clean and decorated with flowers. So here are the gravestones for Esther Ellen Beals, and Alfred Lawson Beals, and then the gravestone for Rachel Vesta Beals. And hers was the only one, I believe, that has an epitaph on it. And it says, "Suffer little children and forbid them not to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven." The most famous resident of Newtown Cemetery is Brigadier General Samuel McCobb, Esquire. He was born in 1744, and died in 1791. But in early 1775, remember the Revolutionary War was getting started. He was the town clerk of Georgetown, and he led a group of men to Boston. A company was established with McCobb as the captain. They fought at Bunker Hill, and then he was made a colonel in 1776 and put in command of the Lincoln County Regiment. In about 1781, he was promoted to brigadier general, and he was in command of the entire Eastern Department. And here's a picture of Samuel McCobb, Esquire. So a stone came up missing from Newtown Cemetery sometime after 1965, and it was eventually found in the woods near Rome, New York in 1972. Maybe it was someone doing genealogy research and they wanted the stone. So, but interestingly, the gravestone says it's Joseph Oakman. And here are the date he died is on here and his age. In the book, Vital Records of Arrowsic, Maine, there is no Joseph Oakman listed. In Find a Grave, in Newtown Cemetery, there is a John Oakman listed who died on this date, and he's not in the vital records of Arrowsic either. So who knows whose stone this really is, and if it was from Newtown Cemetery. Oh, Rome, New York, yeah. Yeah, so in the McKinney-McFadden Cemetery, one of the stones was for Charles McFadden, who died at almost 28 or 29 years in Jalameras, Mexico. And I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that was during the Mexican-American War. So you have to wonder if he was a victim of that war. The Drummond Cemetery could have. The comment was he could have died from lead poisoning. So in the Drummond Cemetery, there are many rows of field stones, maybe near 100, with no names on them. So there are also remnants of slate stones that are indecipherable. In 1889, this cemetery was being destroyed by cattle, and so 5 of the least damaged stones were removed and taken to Drummond Cemetery at Parker Head. There used to be a tomb in this cemetery, but no trace of it remains. One of the more famous, maybe, cemeteries on Arrowsic is the Clark and Lake settlement, but no cemetery has ever been found. So it's an interesting story. The Thomas Clark who went back and resettled or settled Newtown in, 1680? This event took place, or this Clark and Lake settlement happened before Newtown. So Thomas Clark and Thomas Lake, who were 2 Boston merchants, settled between Spring Cove and Mill Island on the Sassanoa side of Arrowsic. And they built a fortified stockade. The Sassanoa was a good place to have a stockade, a fort, because the indigenous people, the Eastern Abenaki, would trade with them for moose and beaver skins engaged in the fishing industry with them and traded masts, staves, and boards. There was a lot of lumber on Arrowsic. So they had this big settlement there, and they also built a shipyard from which at least 12 to 15 boats were launched. Spring Cove was just an ideal place because the Abenakis traveled that route. So the Abenakis were first openly hostile to the settlement in August of 1676, and they destroyed both the Clark and Lake settlement and in Arrowsic and the Hammond settlement in Woolwich. The natives, at that time, the natives were beginning to understand that the English understanding of purchasing property was totally different than what the indigenous people thought it meant. And a couple of years ago, Sheila Spear did a talk on Arrowsic titled Sale or Gift, I think it was. And I recently listened to it. So it was a lot about their views of property ownership. It was very interesting. So the natives felt they were beginning to understand the danger that the English posed to their way of life. The indigenous peoples often felt cheated in their trading transactions with the white man, and many understandings were caused by their interpretation of land ownership. The indigenous peoples often assumed that selling their land meant only that the buyer had the right to use it during their lifetime, after which it reverted back to the indigenous peoples. That wasn't the English view of it. The English king assumed that he owned all of the land in the territory and could therefore sell or give it away. And although the Sagadahoc settlers had signed a peace agreement with local tribes, the entire settlement was attacked and destroyed by Abenaki indigenous people in August of 1676. Between 37 and 50 residents were killed. Many were taken prisoner, and 4 escaped, including Thomas Lake, who was later found and killed. So another account of the massacre is slightly different and really interesting. So prior to this attack, the residents felt perfectly secure, but one very stormy evening, a seemingly very old squaw came to the gate and begged for food. She told a sad tale of being lost and wandering all day in the storm. After some hesitation, they unbarred the gate and let her in. And I'm running way over. Sorry. I'll kind of skip through some stuff. But they gave her a dry blanket. She dried her blanket next to the fire. They gave her food. And when she laid down to what appeared to be sleep, they all went to bed. And it turned out that this was a young man, a young indigenous man, who unbarred the gate and let a group in, and they butchered, this account says they butchered every living soul. And they boasted afterward that they did not leave a single paleface to tell the tale. But the governor escaped and was tracked down and killed and scalped. This is a picture of the Clark and Lake site around 1900. Back in 1967, Harold Brown started an excavation of the site looking for the cemetery. Found a lot of like broken pottery and things like that. And in 1970, Professor James Lehman and students from Bates joined the archaeological dig, and that went on for 6 weeks for almost all of 13 years. And no, they did find fragments of human bones, but they didn't find a cemetery. And so there were, the one I found interesting on this one, the gravestone, or in the town, the listing of gravestones, Milford Oliver was listed as being the town pauper. That's somebody who is supported by the town. The town pauper, yeah. Good point. And then in the Freeman Cemetery, this young man was lost at sea when he was 25. So the oldest date of death from the inventory of gravestones was 1724, and that person is buried in Newtown Cemetery. No birth date or name is listed. It's just initials. It's a rough field stone. It's possibly William Cock. The next oldest date of death was Patrick Drummond, who died in 1761 and is buried in the Drummond Cemetery. And he was born in Ireland and immigrated to the United States. The most recent date of death, according to the inventory done in the early 70s, was Abby Baker, who died in 1933 and is buried in the Freeman Spinney Cemetery. According to the Maine Old Cemetery Association records and findagrave.com, the most recent death is Collingwood C. Shea, who died in 1941 and is buried in the Shea Lawrence Cemetery, but he's not listed in the cemetery inventory that was done in the early 70s. So you can see the discrepancies there. So I'm almost done. Cemetery laws. Ancient burial grounds are ones that were are private cemeteries established before 1880. The owner is generally determined by the deed to the property where the cemetery is located. So it may not still be owned by the family buried there. The owner has to allow access to the cemetery to the descendants of those buried there, and the cemetery should be fenced. So currently, if you want to establish a family cemetery on your property, you can do so. Maine law allows you to do so. It can't be any larger than 1/4 of an acre, and a written description of the property identified as the burial ground, witnessed by 2 disinterested witnesses, must be recorded in the county registry of deeds. I couldn't find how much land you have to have in order to start a family cemetery on your property. I believe in Ohio it's 5 acres, but I couldn't find that anywhere in the records here. So maybe you only need 1/4 of an acre. Who knows? So Craig and I have done a lot of sailing, and in sailing in the South Pacific and stopping at various islands, one of the interesting things I found there in American Samoa is that if a family member dies, they're buried in the front yard, and they decorate the graves with usually like a lace canopy. So somewhere from years ago, I have lots of pictures of gravestones in front of houses in Samoa and other South Pacific islands. So my aspirational goals are to drop a pin at each cemetery and put it in Find a Grave. However, it was brought up to me that then you might have people who aren't descendants traipsing through people's property. So I have to rethink that. Maybe put the road that it's on or something. I'd like to add more pictures of gravestones and cemeteries to Find a Grave and correct a lot of the misinformation. And it'd be great if old headstones could be cleaned and repaired. And the Maine Old Cemetery Association helps with that if you'd like. Here were some of my sources of information, or actually all of them. And that's it. I can take questions.